Rowan Dean, Ross Cameron, and far more importantly, today, a hero of mine for many years, Colonel Richard Kemp, retired British colonel, an expert who's fought in Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia, an absolute truth seeker, a man who has spent his career seeking the truth and happy to tell the truth in the face of a barrage of left-wing assaults. This was the man, Richard, who was attacked in Sydney University by a bunch of anti-Semites. Well, not really attacked. They just shouted rude words at him, and he stood there with a perplexed smile on his face. Richard also gave evidence at the UN about the Gaza war, and we're going to talk about that, has strong opinions about terrorism, about deporting terrorists, about women on the front line. Richard Kemp, welcome to Outsiders.
Thank you.
Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Now, let's kick off. Just tell us a bit about yourself so the viewers know your background just briefly, and we'll get into those meaty topics.
Well, first of all, I should admit I'm a POM. Although my mother's family did originate from Brisbane, the Brisbane area, Rockhampton.
Oh, that explains it, you see. Yeah, that's where the truth-seeking comes from.
I'm not entirely sure why they got sent out here in the first place, but it can't have been for any good reason, unless they were soldiers. But, yeah, so I basically left school one day. I left high school one day and I joined the army the next day. Didn't go to university. And I spent 30 years as a British soldier fighting in pretty much every campaign that the British Army has fought in around the world, including the Balkans, Northern Ireland many times, right, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and often, I'm delighted to say, alongside the Australian Army, Australian forces. And actually one of the biggest influences on me as an army officer was when I was a lieutenant, first started out on a military career. My instructors at my platoon commander's course were both Australian Army officers on attachment to the British Army who had both fought in Vietnam, Peter Abigail and John Barnes. If they're listening, you know, I owe them
of course
a huge,
they're listening. Top-rating show, yeah. They're listening. Now, Richard, you've become... People follow you on Twitter, fantastic, Richard Kemp. Also, your book's best-selling author, and you must buy his books. His book is fantastic. But tell us... You're an expert on the Israeli army, the Israeli Defence Force. You gave evidence at the UN about the Gaza war. Now, you caused a lot of upset. The left all wanted to paint Israel as this kind of terrible, evil entity that was blowing up hospitals and things. Tell us the real truth. You are a truth seeker. Tell us the truth as you saw it in the Gaza war with Israel.
Well, I was in Israel for both of the last two Gaza conflicts. I saw it firsthand. I saw firsthand what the IDF were doing. And I knew all about the IDF anyway. I'd worked closely...
The Israeli Defence Force.
I'd worked with the Israeli Defence Force. I'd worked with Israeli intelligence, including Mossad. I understood exactly how they did things. And it's virtually the same as we do things in Australia and in Britain, the British forces.
Except more effectively.
I wouldn't say more effective, but they are extremely effective. I mean, no soldier ever admits that any other army is better than his own. But they went, I think, probably further than either of our armies have been in trying to save the lives of innocent civilians. They put their own soldiers' lives at risk, and indeed some Israeli soldiers were killed trying to save the lives of Palestinian civilians. And at the same time, they're being maligned by what is, in effect, the world's greatest slur campaign in the whole of history against the state of Israel. And they're right at the forefront, being accused of baby killers, being accused of deliberately murdering civilians, being accused of carrying out war crimes. And I rebutted all of these allegations at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva when I gave evidence to them at the emergency session in which they debated the allegations against Israel.
I mean, when we're talking about Gaza, to me, the fundamental fact, which I think gets obscured and that people don't seem to want to acknowledge or understand, is that Gaza is one of the very, very few examples in human history of an occupying power voluntarily walking out and handing back and saying, OK, if you guys say this is yours and you want to run it...
And they attack you for it.
Here it is.
And then being constantly attacked for leaving. And not only that, but all the infrastructure they deliberately left in place there in Gaza, which was set to push the Gazan people onto a prosperous future.
Yeah.
They just destroyed it because it was Israeli. And I think that the lesson is there for those people who think that Israel should withdraw from the West Bank, from Judea and Samaria. They can't withdraw from the West Bank, because if they did, they would again be attacked. But this time, the attack would be far more serious than anything that can happen from Gaza for geographic reasons.
I saw an estimate that that Hamas, Fatah, PLO, whomever, had spent $100 million of aid money on concrete alone to build tunnels under residential areas from which they could fire rockets onto Israeli villages. $100 million. A fair chunk of it probably came
Julie
from
Bishop
Australian
would have been
aid.
handing it out like that. Here you go.
You're right, and I've been into these tunnels. I've been through, during the last conflict, I went through one of the tunnels, incredibly well constructed, a masterpiece of engineering, far more than you do. Railway lines running down the bottom of the tunnel, you could walk without crouching, everything you could need in a attack tunnel. And yes, paid for by you, paid for by Australian aid, paid for by British aid, in the same way as our aid money, our taxes, our hard-earned taxes are paying to encourage terrorists to attack Israelis. And by the way, all of these people who want to brand Israel as being a country of war criminals, who want to bring Israel down, should not forget that our countries are safer because of Israel.
And we saw that the other day. Benjamin Netanyahu spoke about how Israeli intelligence had helped prevent that terrorist attack in Etihad plane going down over Sydney, which could have killed thousands of people. Now, we saw here, Richard, a horrible cartoon at the time of the Gaza conflict. Fortunately, the guy who wrote the article that led to the cartoon was given the flick. But this was typical of the left, the ABC, Fairfax Press and others, that they always portray the Israelis as the villains. I don't know if we've got that. There it is, that cartoon. Horrible anti-Semitic thing. Showing a hillside overlooking Gaza. I've actually been and stood on that hillside and seen that sofa, which was in the original photo that the cartoon copied. But this is typical of the left, to demonise Israel, anti-Semitic kind of, you know, the large nose and all, that a guy, and the Jews are sitting there deliberately blowing up Gaza. Complete opposite, yes, of the truth.
Total opposite of the truth. I said when I gave evidence to the UN Human Rights Council that no army in the history of warfare has ever taken such effective steps and made such efforts to save the lives of innocent civilians on the battlefield, and it's true. And that finding was confirmed when I was a part of an international delegation of 13 generals, retired generals from around the world, including the great General Jim Molam from here in Australia, who I was lucky enough to see the other day in Canberra. He was a member of that delegation, and we found exactly the same. General Dempsey, formerly the chief of the Joint Staffs in the United States, found exactly the same thing. It's only the left wing, it's only the virtue signalling people in the United Nations, the universities, human rights groups, many left-wing politicians who want to brand Israel as being war criminals. It's the opposite, the diametric opposite of the reality.
If we go back then and say to the pre-existing question of the legitimacy of the state of Israel, where I would say that much of this left critique comes from a starting assumption that the state of Israel is not a legitimate state, and so therefore we go to backfill that argument with whatever facts, allegations, assertions we can find. So what do you say is the case for the existence of the State of Israel?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I always refuse to argue for the existence of the State of Israel in the same way as I don't argue for the existence of Australia. I don't see why I should justify...
We have to these days.
Yeah, well, fair enough. But, I believe that Israel is a very legitimate state. It has every ounce of legitimacy that any other state in the world has. But actually, interestingly, a quick commercial break now, if I may. I presented a film recently, which is called Whose Land, which can be downloaded on the internet. And that film gives a very detailed breakdown of the historical and legal background to the creation of the State of Israel. But in effect, for 3,000 years, there has been a Jewish state in that territory. The only reason why Arabs came into that territory in large numbers was to gain employment from Jewish industry and Jewish agriculture, which had been set up there, mainly around the time of the sort of 20s and 30s.
Well, you say 3,000. I believe it is 3,200 years is the first historical reference from an Egyptian. I'm pretty sure it was Ramses Stele or whatever, which had the stories of his exploits and battles, and one of them referred to the Israelites living in Canaan, who he argued he had destroyed, but actually that turned out to be the beginning of the origins of the sort of precursor to the Hebrew Bible, 1200 BC.
Just talk us a bit more about the threat to the West Bank. So we hear all the time the two-state solution, the two-state solution. But in fact, the two-state solution as envisaged by the Palestinians is one state, which is a Muslim state called Palestine, and the other state, which is a Muslim state called whatever you want it to be, so long as there are no Jews in either of them. That is my understanding of the Palestinian, as was reported to me and 10 Australian journalists in Ramallah. Tell us what you think is the likely future going forward of what happens with the West Bank, what happens with Israel, and this endless so-called two-state solution.
Well, I'm afraid I don't like to be as positive as this and confirm what I consider to be bad news, but there is no prospect of a two-state solution. That's not because Israel doesn't want one.
That's right.
It's not because the United States doesn't want to encourage one. It's because entirely the Arabs, the Palestinians, their leadership in particular, they don't want their own state. They've never fought for their own state. When the West Bank was illegally occupied by Jordan up until 1967, there was no question of let's have our own state. They've been offered their own state many times. They don't want it. They want one thing. They want one thing, the annihilation of the Jewish state. That's all they've ever fought for and all they will ever fight for. They will never agree to having their own state in one part when there is a Jewish state in another part, because they consider that to be occupied Palestinian oblique Islamic land, and they will not stand for it.